Neil, people, including yourself, I believe, have talked about the possibility of a looming cargo recession with all of these tariffs with de minimis. How bad could it get?
Yeah, it's a good question, Mike, and you're exactly right. Is that I think that as these, as we were approaching Liberation Day, remember in April, I think, and then we saw that big
All too well.
announcement. Oh, yeah, exactly. What a fun day, right, for everyone. And then the press conference and all of that. You started to paint a lot of doomsday sort of scenarios in terms of what's going to happen, right? Particularly in our industry, logistics in general, but air freight, specifically. And I think that before I get to sort of whether or not I think there's going to be an air freight recession, I just like to say that I think that everyone can agree that global trade is good for humanity. It's good for societies around the world. It pulls people out of poverty. It allows developing countries to develop further. It creates all sorts of opportunities up and down, sort of the demographic and income vertical, right? And so we would like to see more trade every year. Now, tariffs are not good for trade. And so, from a purely global macro perspectives, this sort of tariff regime with retaliatory sort of then back and forth is not good for global trade and overall isn't good for society, right? And over the long term, that will play out, I think, negatively in terms of how quickly the world moves forward. That all being said, I don't think we're going to see an air freight recession. And I don't think we're going to see a recession because air freight in particular thrives on chaos. Right? Chaos creates opportunity. And I think all my colleagues have said it today, right? We are in a chaotic time right now. Things change every day. You said, if we did this yesterday, we'd already be out of date, right? And by the time we finish recording this, we might be out of date again. And after Trump meets with Putin, we might be out of date again, right? And so I think, air freight does thrive on chaos and because it creates opportunities to attack new lane segments, to develop new products that customers need. And I think that, this industry has learned through all of the prior sort of shocks and chaos that we've dealt with, particularly over the past 10 years, that they've learned how to adapt. And so there are clear winners and losers, right? But I think as a whole, I think the industry is actually holding up okay. I don't see an air freight recession. Volumes are definitely, I think, overall going to be down year over year, but I don't think sort of significantly enough to say we're in a recession. I think there's some trade lanes are going to suffer a heck of a lot more than others. Think China to the U.S., but there are others that are going to far outperform anything we possibly thought, as we headed into 2025. So that's sort of my take on it right now, sort of softening my stance a little bit on the recession piece and thinking just going to be a bit of a downturn, but I think the industry overall will be okay over the next several months.
Well, I'll open this out to everybody. We had, I don't know if it was a surprise. There was a 5% spike in air freight demand in July. There was an element of, maybe this is front loading ahead of the tariff announcements we were all expecting in August. It was front loading, then presumably that means we're going to have a weaker peak season than we wouldn't. What's your view? Maybe start with you, Brandon, on where you think peak season was going to be this year. If it's not going to be recessionary, how does it compare to last year or previous years?
I think somewhat muted, and what you did in fact see was a lot of front loading, but there's just a lot of business out there right now, and so it's hard to pinpoint exactly where we're going to see the peak season. But I would say that generally speaking, it's just the whole summer has been peak so far. As I go back to saying what I said earlier, is that forwarders in our association are busy, and whatever's driving it is it could be a multitude of factors. But I want to go back to what Neel said, because I agree. He could take my place at the Airforwarders Association tomorrow, because I got to tell you, that is exactly our message too. We're bullish on global trade, And maybe Neil and I should go over to the White House and sit down and have a talk at the Oval Office, and hopefully maybe they'll listen to us, because it does create opportunities. And, the reality is that unfortunately, there are many here in the United States that have been disenchanted with it. But overall, globally, trade has been beneficial to our global economy. So we have to hope that we don't upset the apple cart that much. But again, I would agree with Neil. Maybe a recession is not going to happen, because these airlines and these carriers, they're going to deploy to areas of opportunity. So who's the loser? Maybe the United States.
Okay, so trade is a great tool for wealth generation, but maybe in the White House, where they do have the power, they don't quite see it like that. It's more of a political tool, or a tool for all purposes. A Swiss Army knife, perhaps. I think I had someone call it. Damian, are you positive on peak season?
Well, when obviously, as Neil and Brand both said, there are pockets of opportunity out there. You've got Southeast Asia's been growing well, India, Latin America, and then looking at sectors, the high-tech sector, semiconductors, pharma, all of which are great products for air cargo. And also, the chaos that's been caused by all the tariffs. Air cargo does thrive through chaos, and with all the front loading. The one thing says, US Trans-Pacific, obviously that is a big part of the, it's the biggest air cargo trade lane. And when you've got that new November deadline, you would assume that there'll be people looking to move cargo ahead of that, and there'll be a kind of another front loading boost up until then. And then post that date, then certainly on the Trans-Pacific, you wouldn't expect it to be that great, but there's other opportunities around the world, and it's several airlines I've spoken to, the need to be agile was just becoming so important this year, and they're being much more flexible with how they deploy freight capacity, how they analyze their data to make sure that they're on top of which of the markets where there's opportunities. So yes, for those companies, it's just about being as agile as possible.